we're going to go ahead and get started, so we have plenty of time to have a conversation with our panelists, and then also have time for questions and answers and other inputs from you all. My name is John Zemko. I'm a staffer here at the Center for International Private Enterprise. I'm the regional director for Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm delighted to be here with our panelists. We were just having some chats before we got started. I think you're going to find that this is an interesting diversity of experience and exposure on this topic of conflict and how the private sector can and needs to operate in conflict and post-conflict environments. This is a subject that's become near and dear to my heart, working in the Western Hemisphere, so I'm going to take a little bit of privilege with my moderator status and actually perhaps try to add a little dimension from Western Hemisphere perspective. Since we don't have a Western Hemisphere representative on the panel, I'll try to inject some of my own observations as well into our discussion. So I think you've all seen the more elaborate bios, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the entire bios of everybody, but I'll at least introduce them as we go. And as I said, we're going to handle this as sort of a conversation rather than presentation and Q&A sort of format. So hopefully you'll enjoy the format as well. So just to get started, I'm actually going to start with you, Daniel. Daniel is a subject matter expert with the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan. And the reason why I wanted to start with you is because you have looked at and talked about the development or the connection between security and economic development. And I thought you might be a good person to launch us off into this discussion about how you see those two tying together. What are the linkages between the two, particularly in a conflict environment, according to your experience and observation?
Thank you for that. And I'm going to start off with the standard disclaimer that what I'm going to say represents my own views and not the views of the U.S. government or the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. So got to get that out of the way. And I guess I'm going to approach it from the perspective of an informed amateur. I've played around on implementing and overseeing and thinking about this for a while, but I'm going to be channeling a lot more of what a lot of other smart people have done, including my wife, who's gracious enough to be here, take time away from her PhD studies. But I think my kind of main message that is going to be the focus of my comments is that despite a lot of experimentation and trial and error in Afghanistan, in a conflict environment, we know very little about the positive or transformative effects of economic assistance in an active conflict zone in terms of affecting security or stability, however you define that. And that's a shame, because what I've seen are the assumptions that we started with at the beginning of the intervention, say 2001, 2005, have solidified into assertions necessary to sustain an idea that I think we've had a lot of empirical challenges to. And I'm going to offer very briefly kind of why I think that's the case. So I'll start with an assumption and assertion, which is something we can debate. And that is, although in these civil conflicts we see a large amount of criminality and private rent sinking, it's primarily and fundamentally about political power and control. One can debate that, but that's kind of my starting assumption. And therefore, if you're trying to assess the effectiveness of international development or economic assistance or private sector development activities, you have to assess it not off of purely economic outcomes, but political outcomes. And I see kind of 6 main theories of change or causal pathways that I've come into contact with over the years and seen in the literature, seen in programming. The first and most obvious one is employment and conflict. The idea being that if you're unemployed, you're more likely to be violent, either because of an economic motivation or because of radicalization. But we have research such as Do Working Men Rebel, which was written by Jake Shapiro, Ellie Berman, and Joe Felter, that showed that, at least at the subnational level in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Philippines, higher levels of employment are correlated with higher levels of violence. They offer an explanation for why this is. I don't know if it's fully convincing, but it should at least raise a question of this very simplistic, unidirectional view we have of employment and violence. Additionally, I would point out that a depressed labor market also facilitates recruitment for the pro-state forces. Not only does the insurgency benefit from having people that have motivations that are economic, but so does the pro-state. And so we have estimates about 30,000 to 40,000 anti-state forces in Afghanistan. Who knows if they're accurate? This is just kind of an estimate, arrayed against a pro-state force of around 400,000. So again, this very simplistic unemployment equals radicalization or insurgent activity. I don't think is very well supported at this point as a simplistic one-way direction. The second thing that I've heard people talk about, the role of economic development in the private sector and benefiting security, is as a source of revenue for the state to then convert into investments in the security sector. And the Afghanistan case, again, makes it a little bit problematic because the ambition of the state in terms of the number of security forces they have has not been limited by their domestic revenue because of foreign subsidies. So it would be nice, but not necessary at this point. The third way is that it might provide an outlet for wealth and power-seeking individuals who might otherwise go into insurgency or try to contest state control. And this is challenging because the dividing line, at least in the formal economy in a place like Afghanistan, between the formal sector, between public and private, is not very clear. People and families will straddle both. And so I don't think, at least in Afghanistan, we haven't seen the emergence of a discrete public sector, a private sector, where one can pursue their wealth independent of the state. Additionally, the area, part of the economy in the informal side that seems to be the most effective, it has all the things we want, value chains, commodities that are exportable, and a credit system, is illegal. It's opium. And Afghanistan's comparative advantage is its state weakness in a way, both in terms of state capture by bad actors, as well as just the state cannot enforce its laws against cultivating an illegal crop. The fourth that I see is coalition building. This is something in history, kind of like the idea of states might offer a discrete monopoly for import or export to bring in potential elites into the tent of the government. That's possible, but it's just power in Afghanistan is highly fractured. I think that makes real coalition building problematic. We could talk about it a bit more in the discussion. Fifth I've seen is the demonstration effect. So maybe there's variation of violence across the country. You have outposts of stability like a Herat, a Mazar-e-Sharif, a Kabul. And people want that where they are in a conflict-affected space. So they look at that and say, I want that here. I think part of that is true because we see people, particularly conflict-induced internal displacement, people leave and go to those areas. That's why we've seen so much urbanization. But I don't know if we've seen at scale a lot of people in the conflicted areas trying to recreate whatever that is there in the conflict effect, for all the reasons that I'm sure everyone will talk about, the challenges of operating in a conflict. And the final one, I think the most difficult but also very popular, is the provision of public goods as a legitimizing way to make the state more popular with people. And whether we believe the surveys or not, and I know Sarah has written about the problem of surveying in Afghanistan, it still leaves unanswered how would people translate preferences into actual behaviors, pro or anti-state. And this, I think, kind of nicely dovetails into kind of a commonality I've seen of all these theories of change, which is that we can go down the causal chain a couple steps. We can see the investment, which is often economic or social development. We can see the immediate output, say we build a school, kids go to school. But the whole causal chain to get to the political effect is largely unexplored and unknown. And one can say assumptions have to get us there, one can say assertions have to get us there, or ultimately it becomes faith. And I think that's, for me, the greatest disappointment, and I'll conclude with this. We have tried a lot of different things. Money hasn't really been the thing that's held us back, but the literature hasn't advanced a lot on this point, exploring how these causal pathways work, and how we measure it from political outcomes.
Well, you put this on a really positive, constructive path here. So let's keep going. Sarah, you've written on the topic of Afghanistan. I understand, operated a business in Afghanistan.
I did. Yeah.
So I'm curious about how you see some of these observations jiving with your sort of on the ground experience. And I know you've talked a little bit about the connections between corruption and violence as well, and conflicts, and maybe you can give us a little bit.
Yeah, actually, I couldn't agree more with what you just said, and what I'd like to do is maybe take it a step further and say, a potential reason for the negative outcomes that you're talking about. And I would use slightly different vocabulary than you do, but it's basically the same idea. And I'm going to state it pretty baldly. It's that we have the tendency to think that Afghanistan, the government of Afghanistan, is a government that is plagued or afflicted in some way by corruption, that it's got corrupt actors in it. After 10 years there and comparison with a number of other countries that have also been major security crises, like Arab Spring countries, Nigeria, Central Asian countries, the governments of these countries are actually not so much governments that are failing as criminal organizations that are succeeding. They're successful, sophisticated criminal organizations that are achieving their essential objective, which is maximizing resources for the personal gain of network members. And if that's the kind of environment that you're thinking about operating in economically, if you don't have a clear picture of what that environment looks like, you have every chance of actually exacerbating some of the problems I'll touch on in a second. But what that environment looks like is, as you suggested, public and private sector actors. You can't draw this very clear division between public and private sector actors because the networks, the kind of kleptocratic network, straddles. You also can't draw a very clear division between what we would consider to be licit actors and illicit actors. In other words, you have private sector, government, you have criminals like people who traffic in drugs or weapons or wildlife, restricted wildlife or what have you, and you've got terrorists. And very often these kleptocratic networks are actually horizontally integrated across all four of those groups. And that's really difficult for Westerners often to kind of get their heads around. And in particular, if you're a business, if you're either a development agency or the Commerce Ministry, the Commerce Department trying to encourage trade into an environment like that, or if you're delivering development assistance, if you haven't mapped out that network, you risk either reinforcing some of the kind of elements of state function that have been repurposed by this network to achieve its objectives, or you're providing a revenue stream. So one of the biggest, apart from opium, obviously, to Afghanistan's kleptocratic network, the biggest revenue stream was international development assistance, right? And so you're just pouring resources into the coffers of essentially, as I say, a criminal organization. They're also vertically integrated, which means that the shakedowns that happen at the customs post or at street level by cops are being sent, part of it is being sent up the chain. So it's not like the poor cop who's underpaid, is just shaking down a couple of dollars of petty bribery to, support his family. Once you start that process, first of all, they're often deliberately underpaid in order to start this process of bribe extortion so that the money can move upward in the chain. It means that investment in things, obviously, like natural resources, is an issue. So you're talking very sophisticated networks that whose objectives are quite different from the objectives of this conversation, right? Which is economic activity leading out of conflict and toward peace. In fact, under these circumstances, economic activity tends to lead toward more conflict unless it's very carefully sort of thought through. And I just want to say a couple of words about why. So I've got this argument that corruption is actually driving people into the arms of the Taliban, ISIS, Boko Haram, etc. And the argument there is that this corruption, and particularly what we unfortunately often dismiss as petty corruption, here we are having a conversation in the District of Columbia, right? We all know something about corruption. But thankfully, it doesn't usually come up and hit us in the face. It's something we hear about in political conversations. We think about, maybe cronyism in the award of public procurement contracts, et cetera. In a country like Afghanistan or Nigeria or Uzbekistan, you are being shaken down on the street, and it's not happening politely. And it's not always money either. I talked to some Nigerian legal professionals about, the woman who went to the judge to beg him to release her husband on bail, and the judge takes advantage of her. And I'm thinking about the woman, and I'm thinking about her brother, who wants to do what? He wants to shoot the judge, right? So this is northern Nigeria. Boko Haram wants the kid to shoot the judge. And not only that, Boko Haram provides the argument, which is the reason the judge is this depraved, is this corrupt with all of the breadth of meaning that corruption has. The reason he's behaving like this is because he's not obeying God. And if only our government were organized according to the laws of God, this kind of thing would never happen. It's a spurious argument, obviously. I mean, look at Iran, right? But when you're a furious young man in northern Nigeria or southern Afghanistan, and all you have is your dignity and your sister's dignity, it's a pretty persuasive argument. And so that's kind of how I get there. But there are all kinds of other, there are many other types of conflict that are really driven by this type of predatory activity. One is the revolutions that have been happening all around the world, in the last 5 years, right? So the entire Arab Spring, the Maidan in Ukraine, and then things start to spin out of control, right? Once you get into abrupt regime change. There's even an argument that says, my colleague at Carnegie, Marwan Washer, who's the head of our Middle East program, is saying, look, first you had the Arab Human Development Reports. They were showing what was going on in the Arab world. That was the first kind of warning signal. The second was initially peaceful protests. And then when those didn't deliver better governance, you're starting to get ISIS, and in Egypt there's a pretty serious insurgency that we're not hearing that much about. In other words, it kind of moves in that direction. You have, symbiotic alliances between corrupt governments and transnational criminal superpowers. Again, criminal, drug, the narcotics industry is a very vibrant economic activity. So I guess all of this is a little bit depressing, but we're talking about how, I guess we're suggesting that even before we think about how economic activity can help get countries out of conflict, we have to understand a little bit better the ways in which economic activity, private sector activity gets countries into or exacerbates the conflict that countries can get into.
Great. Some of the, looking at it from my point of view, from sort of a Western Hemisphere point of view, some of the things you're talking about make perfect sense, even in a rather different, social context and and economic context. And I think make some comments about that as we go along. But first, let me offer the floor to you, Jason. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the U.S. government's approaches to working with business in these sorts of conflict situations, and elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure. So I work in the State Department, and I work within the State Department in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And then within that bureau, we actually have a team that focuses on what we call business and human rights, which is kind of a, in the grand scheme of human rights, relatively new area of practice. And there's sort of various ways to trace the roots of it, but the kind of seminal moment, which also corresponded with the development of the team that I now lead, was the development of the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework, which is also known as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. It's a very kind of unique document which elaborates the respective duties of states to protect people from human rights abuses, including by the private sector within their territory and jurisdiction, and then the separate responsibilities of companies to respect human rights, to ensure that their business activities don't have adverse impacts on people's human rights. And the third pillar remedy is ensuring that there are remedies available to individuals who are nevertheless impacted, and those remedies can be provided by the state or by the company or by third parties. So it's a very sort of simple framework, but actually one that was really transformational in terms of helping to establish a kind of a taxonomy of respective responsibilities and duties that helped everyone kind of move forward away from more contentious periods of conversation among the various stakeholders. Not to say that we have in any way necessarily put the contention behind us, but I think we've seen since 2011 much more collaboration and cooperation. And my team and our bureau and the State Department more generally is very much in favor of this kind of approach, which is essentially voluntary in nature, for a variety of different reasons we can get into. And we've been working in this vein for a number of years, actually, even before the guiding principles were established. There are a number of multi-stakeholder initiatives, we call them, which are efforts that bring together companies within usually a single sector. Governments, and they can be governments both who are the home jurisdictions of those companies or the host jurisdictions where the companies are operating and facing risk, and civil society. And so, one that's very pertinent to the topic we're discussing today is the voluntary principles on security and human rights, which was established in 2000. The UK and US governments got together after a series of pretty high-profile incidents involving, international oil and gas companies in places like Colombia and Burma and Nigeria, and allegations of their involvement in human rights impacts in those places. The principles basically at a very high level, establish and start to kind of sort of provide a risk management framework for those companies in their dealings with security forces, whether it's private security or public security forces. And the initiative that was built on top of it has worked over the last decade plus to try and kind of, create a safe space where these various stakeholders can come together and share experiences and lessons learned. Promote some degree of transparency and accountability among the companies who have subscribed to implementing these principles. A more recent example that's also pertinent, I think, to this topic and conflict areas is an initiative called the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Service Providers, which sprang out of an effort that the Swiss government and the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, put together in the 2000s as state use of private security started to really increase and change in important ways. So the Montreux document, which was finalized in 2008, is a sort of restatement of international law for kind of how states should be responsible in their contracting with private security in complex environments. And then the industry sort of after that exercise was completed said, we could really use some guidance ourselves. So the code of conduct process began. In 2010, the code was finalized. 2013, an association, independent association established in Geneva under Swiss law, was created. It has a tripartite structure with representation on the board from companies, from NGOs, and from governments, and we've been very involved in that. So happy to talk about any of these initiatives. But sort of taking a step back, I think, all of the points that Daniel and Sarah have laid out, I think are really important for everyone to understand and appreciate. I think, and I wouldn't contest any of them, but I think where we kind of come at it from a little bit more of a practical perspective is businesses are nevertheless going to be conducting business in many of these complex environments, and what can we do to ensure that they mitigate against the kinds of risks that you all have very articulately sort of set out, and that they address impacts even when the mitigation doesn't work. And I think what's interesting when you think about conflict, and we think that this applies universally. It's obviously not the risk of corporate activity impacting human rights negatively is not exclusive to conflict zones. But in order to understand why the sort of conflict context is so much more challenging, I want to just kind of walk everybody through kind of a mental exercise. Think of a kind of a Cartesian plane with an X and Y axis. And if you think of the risk running vertically on one side, and that's risk of both incidence and then severity of incidence. So that kind of combined measure of risk running vertically. And then horizontally, if you think about control, the amount of control that a company may have over the activities that create those risks. The sort of when a company is directly operating in a particular place, and the impacts or risks are associated with their direct activities, their extraction or their production or their sales or marketing, then the risks are both higher, but so too is their control over the actions and circumstances. As you think about the sort of less direct impacts that may occur through contracting, service providers, and business relationships, and dealing with governments, the risk, again, being the risk of the number of events and the severity of events, can go down a little bit, but the control also does. And then as you work into kind of the kinds of supply chain challenges that businesses may have, when they're not even operating in a complex environment, but the sort of raw materials that they need are in those places. Again, their control is much more limited, but so too is necessarily their control.
Their risk.
They're both
Right.
are actually a little bit lower. So in general, that's a sort of happy story because the things you're most likely to be held accountable for are the things you can control. I think what's important about, and especially thinking about complex environments or high risk environments, is that you have to necessarily add a third dimension. And so if you think of kind of a z-axis coming out of that, that measures the sort of options that are available to you as a company. The fact of the matter is that once you are in a place and you are invested, and perhaps you have a long-term lease or a concession, your options are much, much more limited than if you are simply sourcing raw materials from a particular place, and you may have actually a range of places that you can go if you feel like one particular place in a country or an entire country is too risky. And that's really where, and that of course is even more, that's heightened in a complex or a conflict scenario. So that's where I think companies ultimately end up facing a lot of challenges. We work a lot with companies that are sort of already in these very difficult places, and the sort of nuclear option of pulling out entirely is very costly or challenging. It's not impossible, and we're starting to see it happen, and I think that's really interesting. One example of note is that Telenor, which is TeliaSonera, which is a Swedish telecommunications company, has recently decided to actually extricate itself from all of its markets in the sort of Near East, South Central. I think there are 11 markets that they actually have. They provide cell service and mobile service. So that's, and part of, as we understand it, part of the reasoning, the rationale for that is because of the sort of inextricable human rights challenges that they were facing in those contexts, and they were not able to manage the risk to their own satisfaction, so they decided they just needed to get out. Now, whether that's ultimately good for the people in those countries is something we can talk about. But I think more importantly, now that human rights due diligence and these concerns about the kinds of impacts that you can have are really being mainstreamed and well understood, or at least much better understood, companies need to think before they go in to these complicated places about whether it's really worth it, and what kinds of steps they need to take to prepare the ground before they go in to mitigate risk, and what threshold they will set for themselves in terms of eventually pulling the plug if need be. One of the things that we're doing, we talked a little bit about this before the panel got started, to try and encourage that kind of anticipatory thinking and due diligence in Burma, which is a country where I would argue actually overall, the influx of investment from Western companies that has resulted from the removal of sanctions has actually been a positive thing, at least in the near term, and we'll see over time how it turns out. But one of the things that we did when we lifted sanctions, the U.S. government, was we used our authority under the statute that provides the executive with discretion on the use of sanctions, to leave in place a reporting requirement. So companies, U.S. companies investing $500,000 or more in Burma need to report publicly about what systems and policies they have in place to address certain risks related to human rights, labor rights, land tenure risks, and corruption. And that doesn't, we're not prescriptive about what the policies need to say. In fact, you can satisfy the requirement by reporting that you have no systems and policies, and that technically means you're compliant with the reporting requirement. Of course, that will also attract a certain amount of scrutiny and attention, and that's actually part of the whole deal. But what we're trying to signal to companies is that it is really important when you go into a place like Burma to think very hard, to use a phrase of a major U.S. company that they've kind of coined, to look before you leap, or to look around corners. So that's kind of what we try and do, is work with industry and civil society to help make more information available, to help encourage companies to think about these kinds of risks and how they can manage them and how they can address impacts. So leave it there, and we can discuss more in the Q&A.
Okay, great. I wanted to sort of present a little bit of sort of the Western Hemisphere viewpoint, because I think it may bring out maybe another level of conversation about the role of business in these sorts of environments, because the Western Hemisphere experience is somewhat different. And in this case, I'm going to talk specifically about Mexico, where SIPE has had a project, working with, sort of building citizen security. And I'm going to try to draw it into some of the topics some of the issues that you're talking about. But what we've seen there, the story that we've tried to help the business community in Mexico tell, is the case of border violence, on the border with the U.S. Where levels of violence have approached some of the levels that we've seen in Afghanistan and elsewhere, in areas like Tijuana in the late 2000s, and certainly now, and places like Ciudad Juarez and Tamaulipas State in northern Mexico, where there's still really huge problems. But one of the things that we've seen there is that, given the level of commerce that happens between the two countries, there's a high level of incentive for business to take a more positive role. At least we've seen in the case of Tijuana, a very positive role for business, wanting to work with government officials and wanting to try to find solutions to security problems, because there's a lot at stake. There's commerce at stake, a lot of money in commerce at stake. So if the border closes, that means revenues are down, or people are getting kidnapped all the time. Then that's pretty unproductive time spent. So all of these are like lowering economic activity and lowering incomes for people. So there's, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses, there's a lot of incentive in that circumstance to cooperate. Now, there's a lot of hurdles to that too, because there's the fear of reprisal. There's all sorts of other factors that come in. But we have seen in the case of Tijuana, a case where the business community led the charge to forcing local public officials and national public officials to deal with this problem. And some of the vertical grayness that you're talking about how you can't distinguish between sort of criminal organizations and government, and legitimate business and criminal organizations, you see in Mexico as well. And that creates, to some extent, the problem that you were talking about government not wanting to really address the problem, or in the case of Mexico, denying that the problem even existed, even though people were dying, hundreds at a time, in certain months, right on the border of the U.S. So part of the role of the business community in that case was to hold government officials' feet to the fire and start dealing with the problem, and to do it in a cooperative way. So I present that example to maybe give us another level of reflection on how can business perhaps play a more positive role. If you can get business, I would posit that if you can get business to the point where it really has a stake, an economic stake in the process, and I'm talking about purely private activity, that maybe they're going to find their way to supporting change, or supporting a better, more secure environment, or working with officials, or forcing officials to come up with solutions. And I don't know how much that kind of a solution might have context in Afghanistan or some of the other countries you're talking about. But I don't know, Sarah, does any of that sort of bring
it's
true?
In the countries that I look at, which are acutely corrupt ones, it's really hard to actually conduct business without becoming part of the system. Essentially, it's a system that functions like a mafia, where it's criminogenic. Essentially, people are promoted in the system based on how criminal they are. And actually, Tilia Sonera, I suspect another motivation for getting out was the gigantic, they were involved in a huge bribery scandal in Uzbekistan that caused the CEO to have to resign, and they're in litigation, and it's gigantic, and it was a kind of 26% across the board. And the thing is that these are quite sophisticatedly camouflaged as, you know, local partners, joint venture activities, and things like that. I think the principle is a good one, particularly for FDI into countries like this. So we were talking earlier about mining and about the extractives, basically, and particularly oil is going, not right this second because of low prices, but in general is going into more and more conflict prone places. And what's really interesting is to see how often in extractive industry budgets, they're not really consolidating the costs that accrue to them because of what one might call the resource curse. And so I think for the moment, mining may be doing a better job of that. But I think for the moment, they're again, it's a little bit of short-termism where you sort of cut the deals with the government that you need to, and you throw some CSR. I'm being a little nasty here, but you throw some CSR dollars, you know, into the immediate neighborhood and hope that that placates the natives, if you will. Whereas in the types of environments we're talking about, the potentially toxic interaction of FDI with governments who don't have the people's interest totally at heart is so significant for the bottom lines of these companies. And Telia Sonera is one, but the others, the entire oil industry getting out of Nigeria. I mean, it's likely to slow down now, but it's been unbelievable to watch Shell and Chevron, I mean, just getting all out of their onshore investments. And these are gigantic investments. And so I think there's an argument to be made to particularly the major long-term, as you said, some of these investments are really hard to get out of once you get into them. And so for companies in that situation, understanding this potentially negative dynamic between their investment and increasing insecurity, and therefore how that then comes back to hit their bottom line, should be ideally an argument for them to begin thinking a lot more broadly about corporate social responsibility. So in, for example, the extractive sector, it's not just about the local villages right where you have your plant. It's about, am I part of a dynamic where the economy in this country is becoming de-diversified, where the revenues that I am putting into the economy, I know they're being stolen, and I know they're being sent offshore. I know how the government officials are driving around in ridiculous cars, and it's infuriating the population. Therefore, I actually have a long-term interest in not kind of colluding with that development. And in fact, in thinking through how would my CSR, how could it be used to offset the de-diversification of the economy? How could my local content requirements not just be limited to teaching people how to, put bolts on oil pipelines, but instead local content could be much more diverse so that you're not reinforcing de-diversification, you're actually helping expand, the range of skills that are existent in this economy, et cetera, et cetera. I think those are some ways, but it takes a real effort, and it takes a really kind of high-minded view of an extremely painfully candid view of some of the realities, you were raising in the very beginning.
Yeah, I guess if I can
Sure.
kind of build on that. I expect businesses to pursue a profit and loss logic, right? And if they don't, I start to worry about them. So with that in mind, I think businesses are quite good at recognizing risk. They might make mistakes, right? But I mean, for the most part, they're concerned about risk. And I would caution against conflating, particularly for the sake of lessons, processes and dynamics that work in a post-conflict peace-building sense in the midst of active conflict. They're very
or
different.
even pre-conflict,
Or
which is
pre-conflict,
kind of
right.
what we're talking about, where the drivers can head it toward more conflict.
Right. So, I mean, most of my comments are focused on in the midst of active conflict, usually politically directed conflict, as opposed to maybe Western Hemisphere, where it's more criminality. I think the work of maybe Chris Blattman looking at Liberia and Chicago is a good example of that, but then the translatability of that to an active conflict is problematic. But going back to the idea of businesses will seek to understand the environment so as to operate and succeed in that environment. I don't see a lot of evidence of businesses trying to actively shape the environment. And it might be the case. It might be that businesses pursuing profit and loss can positively impact as well as negatively impact. We have literature talking about war profiteers and hiring certain types of actors that in turn do bad things. But I'm not really clear if there's a lot of literature experience based on how in the midst of an active civil conflict, businesses pursuing a profit and loss logic in turn create more stability. I just don't think it's there. And that's all I would want to say on that, kind of building on Sarah's point. We have to be careful of conflating operating within with shaping positively. And that's not to say that the lessons of Burma or Mexico aren't applicable, but we had a giant experiment in Afghanistan. This was the idea behind it. And I hope that if there is evidence of this, we'd see more of it in the literature.
Did you have any particular comment on that?
No. I mean, I think that I think in Latin America, it is a very different. I think the Afghan context and active conflict, it is important to sort of identify that as for what it is. I do think, though, that the kind of taxonomy of conflict is changing, and I think part of Sarah's point is that it's actually not as easy to kind of sort of draw a box around pre-conflict, conflict, and post-conflict states. It's a very sort of fluid transition, and sometimes particular parts of a given country are more similar to a non-conflict context, whereas others are in complete conflict. So it gets very challenging, and especially if you're a global business that's trying to come up with a sort of global approach and systems and policies that are going to be useful no matter where you're doing business, it's really complicated. It's really challenging, and I think it may be partly just because usually the right approach to very complicated problems is to try and focus on simplistic simple approaches or answers or methodologies. But for us, the kind of guiding the touchstones are being as knowledgeable as possible and being as transparent as possible. And so even though those things gathering information and in particular engaging with local stakeholders can sometimes be quite challenging, ultimately we think, not based on any kind of academic study but just based on what we know from practice, that that ultimately is actually a really good way to understand risk and insulate yourself from risk, and being transparent, even though sometimes that means admitting that you're in a place where there are really high risks and potentially inviting certain kinds of liability, not necessarily legal liability, although that too, but also just reputational liability. That ultimately it's actually better to inoculate yourself early on by being transparent about what you know, what you don't know, what you're doing, what you perhaps think you can't do given the circumstances, and so that's not particularly helpful to anybody, I think, who's really grappling with these challenges, because they already I think generally know that. But it is helpful, I think, for us as the U.S. government to be kind of pushing these principles and this kind of overarching approach at higher levels within companies, because there's oftentimes huge disconnects between the business managers and the security managers on the ground and the C-suite people who are ultimately deciding how resources are allocated and how risk is measured on the grand scale. And so we think that these kinds of, the UN guiding principles and these kinds of voluntary approaches that make companies sort of recognize these issues and incorporate them into their systems and policies at very high levels are helpful in that respect, and hopefully sort of can cut down that distance between the people on the ground and the people ultimately who are responsible for the company.
Can I come in on top of that for just a second?
Sure.
On information. I also think there's I think it's really, really critical, this, the sort of information point, and in particular as part of the planning function. So again, for companies to feed back what they're learning on the ground, even potentially in one country, in order to inform a very serious fact-finding process before making a big investment or as part of the planning process. But in particular, I think how they define risk, how they even understand risk, too often, risk is considered to be risk of immediate attacks on on the company's plants or infrastructure, or risk of prosecution. Like, I just love hearing corruption risk as understood by US companies is the risk that they're going to get prosecuted for bribing, which is a very narrow way of understanding corruption risk. And so I would do a pitch for a broader understanding of risk, number one, but number two, a much more hard-headed assessment of the environment, so that it's not just about, oh, this part of a country is risky or this individual might be a criminal, but actually, what does the network look like? What does this horizontally integrated network look like that I will be interacting with? And that's really difficult information to get, but it literally means starting to build the spiderweb diagram. Who are my likely implementing partners? So here's the government. Is this implementing partner, this either construction company or logistics company or whatever it may be, does it belong to the cousin of the, vice president? And if that's the case, what does this forest look like that I'm actually going to be trying to navigate? And again, obviously, if there's a profit to be made, companies are going to, often go in and make it. But both in terms of their global citizenship and, more to the point, in terms of their mid to long-term risk, they've, I think, really got to be going into these environments with their eyes much more open, in a much more sophisticated way than they have been in the past.
Just briefly, this kind of reminds me of a conversation my wife and I had with a guest who is doing business facilitation in North Korea. Training. It's not post-conflict, but a lot of these kind of incompatibilities of life experience, education, perspective, world outlook. We were talking about how it's very similar to the types of complaints and concerns I've heard from people on the USG side trying to facilitate business connections between foreign firms and Afghan firms. And I wonder, just trying to be very pragmatic, if I had a full layout of essentially who has power, and that's like the guidebook for who I have to bribe. Because you're going to be approached by a lot of people, right? Some of whom claim to be legitimate power brokers who you should pay attention to, and many who probably can't bring anything to bear against you. So if you have this sophisticated understanding of who actually exercises power, who's connected to who, what does one do with that other than navigate and wade out the chaff from the wheat in terms of who do I have to interact with seriously?
So, number one, you can't bribe, period. So the answer is, if you cannot get into an environment without bribing, don't go. It's just that simple. Secondly, it actually turns out, so I never paid a bribe in Afghanistan. I just refused to do it. Mm-hmm. And eventually, by making enough of a fuss, I could not pay a bribe. I ran a business in Afghanistan without paying a bribe. And I was friends with all of the traffic cops in Kandahar. Not only did I not give them any money, I actually once, when someone asked me for money, I said, why don't you give me some money? And he did. So again, I'm not saying it would be easy for an Afghan to do that, but it is easy for foreigners to do it. Then you have things like collective action. If it's really impossible to do it, well, let's get everybody else in my sector. You know what? And let's actually join forces, and then we actually make an economic impact. And finally, I would say it's actually not true that every single actor in these environments is a bad one. The system is rigged, full of bad actors, but particularly in the private sector, part of the problem with U.S. contracting, was that we just never bothered in the beginning to open up the bidding process. We basically gave the kleptocratic networks the doorway, right? They got to choose who was allowed to bid for our contracts. And we never went outside the base, and we certainly could have in 2002 or 2003, to have an open bidding process. And I would say the same thing goes for countries where we don't kind of own the keys to the kingdom the way we did in Afghanistan. But in a country like Tunisia, even Ben Ali's Tunisia, if French and US investors had really made an effort, had that network diagram and then looked at, okay, where are the companies that aren't part of it, and had consolidated their investment with the companies that don't, and then if those companies were retaliated against, then start to scream about it. I think maybe the outcome might have been a little bit different. Maybe that might have shaped the environment. I agree with you that in current state of play, businesses don't try. They try to make things work for themselves. They don't think about, wow, is there any way that our actions together could actually influence this environment, except to lower customs duties or something like that, So
I just want to underscore
definitely.
that point. I mean, I guess I would add it to my sort of simple concepts that I think ultimately can be really important for businesses trying to address these risks. Is the collective action, the sort of getting over the fact that you can talk to your competitors about some of these same challenges, and that you're not giving them a competitive advantage by sharing with them information about risks that ultimately undermine everybody's ability to do business effectively, and more broadly than just between companies, but also with civil society all the way from grassroots organizations on the ground to up to international NGOs who have the ability to bring a lot of public pressure to bear on either yourself as a company if they think you're not doing the right thing, or the government or the malicious actors who may be the real source of the problem. But if there isn't that understanding and transparency between the companies and those NGOs, it's more likely that you're going to have the pressure falling on the companies because they're much more readily available and recognizable. There are sort of easier pressure points. And then you sort of go down that downward spiral where companies say, oh, I can't trust NGOs. They're just out to, with the gotcha sort of mind frame. But what we've seen, I think, in these multi-stakeholder initiatives is where you can actually, if you can build those platforms for trust and collective action, it's actually quite useful. And then, of course, the other critical component is the government, right? And so, being able to get the U.S. government, to say, through our embassies and our other means to governments that, look, this is a problem. It's not just a problem because we preach all kinds of high-minded ideals, but because you're really putting our companies in a bad situation. That's not going to be good for us. It's not going to be good for you. And allowing us to make those arguments, which we do all the time. But I think it's more useful if we can do it collectively and in a coordinated fashion.
Absolutely. Before we open it up to questions from the audience and observations from the audience, I wanted to rip off a couple of those things. You provide me the perfect segue, because I think that, again, looking from the Western Hemisphere viewpoint, I think sometimes we define in very specific ways terms like pre-conflict, conflict, post-conflict. But from a business perspective, when we're talking about risks to the business, I mean, I don't think they necessarily distinguish in the same ways. The risks may come from different points, but in a country like Mexico, in a city like Tijuana, where you are approaching like 200 murders a month, that to me is a conflict environment. You have a conflict going on. It may not be defined in quite the same ways we did in Afghanistan, but it's as risky for a business to operate in that environment as it is when they're fearing Taliban or any other sort of appearance. But I think also some of the solutions tend to cut across, and I think we're starting to get at some of those solutions, which is, to my mind, really finding critical mass. And maybe this means finding businesses that are tired of playing the corruption game, that want to clean up the environment, and finding enough of them that you find that critical mass. And I think that means we've talked a fair amount about assistance to U.S. companies wanting to work in these sorts of environments, but I think probably it also means finding alliances between local businesses of
Absolutely.
different sizes and
Yeah.
the foreign businesses to create
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
critical mass
Absolutely.
to get to the solution. And that eventually, I think, is what creates the upward spiral instead of the downward one. So, I don't know, unless we have any other
No, let's.
comments on that,
Yeah,
should we start seeing
definitely.
if there's some questions
Thoughts.
in our audience here?
Questions
please,
or thoughts?
Yeah, please
or-
identify yourself too.
Yeah, exactly.
Born in the West, retired from USA, Asia, Near East for a long time, but still actively engaged, at least here. Very fascinating insights. I love it. In my heart, I love private sector work. I've watched many countries. I've seen adages over the years and had very positive response to the concepts, for instance, that there is a generalization that democracy in its true form really is difficult to bloom until you get to a certain average household income in many countries. And that at that point, if you can expand economic growth above that, perhaps you have a much stronger chance for democracy. Likewise, that corruption, if you really want to win the battle in corruption, you really need to at least equal economic rents and economic returns so that the average person can go beyond corruption, and that these generalizations have some very optimistic response for supporting economic growth and private sector development. And it's clearly depressing to think that, maybe this is clearly not a path that's going to work, because there are some very, very real challenges. There's such a difference between levels of country in conflict and not. So these generalizations probably aren't much worth. But I would hate to give up on the concept that economic development in private sector is not a leading arrow in the quiver. Particularly, I spent many, many years in Indonesia, which is a terribly corrupt country, although it's not really in conflict. But you look at countries which are approaching median income, and why have they yet to break through their corruption melees there? They may be starting, but they've worked on this for many, many years. And it seems that really the concept is private sector isn't necessarily just supporting individual economic growth, individual job creation, or investments. But private sector needs to be looked at as a structure as much as individual growth. And so the question is, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, you went in and you may have supported job creation, but there were no banking systems, there were no courts, no way to get justice except a lawyer jirga or maybe the chief in the tribe in Iraq. There is no private sector structure. There was no place else to go to get a loan except for the corrupt businesses and the leaders. So there was no private sector. And I would argue, isn't there, or ask basically, might we look more at structural rather than individual economic challenges, and how we can build structures to get ad hoc lending and ad hoc ways to adjudicate what aren't really contracts in many countries? Can't we look more at the sector, at the structure, rather than the individual? And when you get to bigger countries like Indonesia, how do you, these deep corrupt things, the role I would hate to see big businesses give up on these types of major investments, because they are part of the global economy, and that's the only thing that's forcing the corrupt banks, the corrupt judicial systems, the corrupt legislatures to start and reassess, because you can't conduct business in a global economy anymore. So I would hope there's other ways to go about this, which perhaps aren't so fraught with very serious challenges.
Comments?
I'd just like to jump in on the first point, which is, I think, a really important one. Here in this country, we have a tendency to put in opposition public and private sector, right? We see these as two opposite different animals. And so we all love to talk about how the private sector is so important to, the health and happiness of the American people, right? But what goes unremembered sometimes is that that's the private sector within, when there is a basic set of structures, of public sector structures that are already there. There's a kind of like the playing field has been ruled off by, our Constitution, our courts, our contract law, our et cetera, our police force, all that stuff creates a playing field within which we can then talk seriously about private enterprise and individual initiative and innovation and Silicon Valley and all that stuff. But when you're talking about a lot of these countries, that institutional infrastructure doesn't exist. And so that creates some of the disconnect when the types of assumptions that you were torpedoing are made, because those assumptions, I think, the assumption behind the assumption is that you've got all of this infrastructure, which in these countries that you don't.
Yeah, I guess I would kind of build on Sarah's comments and say, for me, it depends partially on the goal that you have in mind, and that's how you help assess progress against it, as well as the historical analogies we bring to this contingency, which is largely unknown. Right? I've heard often in the context of Afghanistan from long service USAID people who I know very well, they reference post-war Germany, post-war Japan, post-Korean War Korea. Ashraf Ghani has mentioned South Korea and Singapore. And when I look at it, I don't really see what's analogous with the current context. I get that that's what we'd like to eventually get to. I'd like it to be a Singapore that's largely reduced corruption and has a competent bureaucracy. That's a heterogeneous city-state where people are valued for their merit. I'd like that to happen, but I don't see that being analogous to the challenge the Afghan state faces today. Similarly, the challenge of reconstructing post-war Germany and Japan really has no analogy except for the magnitude of the investment. But in terms of like the establishment of states, state authority, the fact that you can be taxed, World War II Germany and the Soviet Union probably represented the maximum extent of stateness that we've seen in history, in terms of extracting manpower and people, directing it towards something that's probably not in their interest, and seeing it through to a very bitter end. So when I look for historical analogies, because I'm more of a governance person, I'm interested in how power is acquired, maintained, and exercised, the contest for that. I see analogies maybe looking back to Tilley's work and the rise of nation states in Western Europe. I look to maybe warring states Japan. They're not perfect analogies. You can pick out parts and say, well, Japan was ethnically homogenous, and so why does that make sense? But you see pockets of success, relative stability, a lot of contest for power, and people responding for the most part to a power dynamic. Again, I think we have to be explicit on what our goals are, what analogies we bring to bear when crafting our ideas, and how appropriate or what aspects it is in those analogies that we think are most salient for the particular challenge we face.
Is it on? My name is Joe Windrum. I actually work with Daniel at SIGAR. But I have a question, since we're talking about conflict, and we've been talking about corruption and where that fits into these types of environments. But in a place where you have very active insurgency, and you're talking about also more than an insurgency, but also another government, whereas the Taliban sees itself as a legitimate government. And so you don't just have the Afghan government person coming to collect the taxes from a business or from a farm or from wherever. You also have Taliban actors, and there's many areas in a country like Afghanistan where you don't have Afghan government control. So I guess my question would be for Sarah, who's worked over there and owned a business over there. And you were talking about, you never had to give a bribe because you made it clear right from the get-go, and the longer you were there, the more they understood that you weren't going to do that. They got to a point, okay, this is a person who doesn't play by our rules, so we're going to have to work around that. But what about the insurgency or like the Taliban? Because they're there too, and they're going to be trying to get their piece of the pie.
From us, we didn't That didn't happen to us either. I mean, there was a project we had to back out of. We had a whole plan to get raw materials from a district that was a very contested district, and we deliberately went into that district, you know, working directly with elders and things like that. It was a case of a business trying to shape the environment, you know, but we were way behind. I mean, it was, we were overtaken by events. That then became the Taliban just moved right into that district, so we didn't, you know, we obviously couldn't, that contract could never be fulfilled. We did get one call to trying to extort something from us, and basically that wasn't going to happen either. So, I mean, then it starts getting dangerous because I was in a position where I could trace the call, so I knew it was actually not from Kandahar province. It was not from our province. It was from the next province over. And I sensed, I didn't answer. Anyway, what I did was basically everybody changed their numbers and all that. I mean, we've been sort of up against it, but, you know, one of my cooperative members' brother, who lives and farms in a Taliban district, he paid taxes. I mean, no, just, you know, there's no way around it. When there is, and I think every local business in Kandahar paid taxes to the Taliban. I don't know what to say other than that you've got to do it, you know, in that sense. Yeah, I sort of don't know where you, and similarly, if the government is going to extort its bribes at the point of a gun, you're going to give them. I mean, you know, so I was more talking from the perspective of foreign direct investment, you know, and where if you're in an environment where literally you're going to get shot if you don't pay a bribe, at that point it's time to start thinking about following Delia Sonara, I think, you know. But it's a great question.
More questions?
Thank you. My name is Trisha. I am the Women in Economy Fellow at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. So coming into this, I've been working on a report with the consulting firm Accenture on 8 multinationals' CSR initiatives in Nigeria, specifically looking at their work on women and girls, but looking more at the areas of health, education, and I heard you talking about CSR a little bit, Sarah, and I, writing this report, had much more of the perspective that John talked about in Tijuana, where I saw these businesses actually having more of a say, and then perhaps you might think they do. I might be putting words in your mouth that are incorrect there, but I'm curious to see what you see these companies' roles as being in a country like Nigeria, where they're operating still. Some of them are pulling out a little bit, and along with that, there are CSR initiatives, but we also heard from people on the ground there saying, no, we still run our health clinics in the areas that Boko Haram has control. We just got better security and stronger armored vehicles. So I'm curious to see if you guys think that these types of initiatives have any role in ending conflict, and if not, it still seems like they're working towards a noble goal. And do you see that strengthening, the health and education of a country does have a role in the creating a post-conflict state eventually?
Well, I mean, I can say the U.S. government, I think, is certainly very positive about companies acting in a sort of philanthropic capacity. Which is, for the most part, what corporate social responsibility is. It's really not that much different from USAID or a private philanthropy or anyone else who wants to support, whether it's health or education or any other kind of basic human need in a place where there is a lot of need. So certainly that's generally a positive thing. I think companies just like USAID and private foundations need to be very careful and considerate about how they do that, because they can end up in some of the very sort of similar binds that companies end up working in these complex environments. But I think what's important about the distinction that we draw between business and human rights and CSR is that business and human rights starts from the principle of, corporate philanthropy starts from the principle of this is your choice if you want to as a company, build a health clinic or provide some scholarships or whatever. Human rights is not a choice. It's obligatory. It must be respected, and it's about looking internally at what you do as a company and how that can impact people's rights. And so it's a very different starting point, and then you end up at pretty different endpoints in terms of where you focus your attention. But there's nothing to say you can't do both, and that's certainly something we've seen people do. And I think if you do one well, there are likely to be sort of positive overlaps in terms of the information you're gathering, and there are ways to design your CSR so that it really does help you on the business side as well. So I think it's important to understand that business and human rights is a very different approach, but companies can do both.
I didn't mean to say that businesses don't have a say on CSR. It's that the ones that I looked at tended to be very focused on the immediate local environment, like right around where they were operating, and it tends to be quite humanitarian. Whereas in the particular context that I was looking at, which was resource extraction, it seemed like there was a rather broader aperture that they could have brought to the idea of CSR. So it's not that I feel like they're constrained. On the contrary, I feel like they constrain themselves to some extent. And the thinking tends to be quite narrowly humanitarian. So the types of programs you're looking at would be exactly what I'd expect, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them. I'm just suggesting that there might be a more systemic approach to the way these companies are actually fueling conflict that could be addressed to some extent via CSR, but isn't.
So I think you bring up a couple great points. One, there were CSR-like things in Afghanistan. The Strategic Provincial Roads Program had a community outreach capacity building component, which is very much along the lines of the hearts and minds argument of, if I give you something, you'll like me, and therefore you won't stop me from doing something else I'm doing, road building, for whatever purpose, whether to help you increase your market access to health facilities, facilitate security force movement, whatever, but I'm doing these small projects for the sake of that. I don't think that maybe it was a scaling issue, it wasn't of sufficient magnitude, but it didn't appear to actually have any effect in terms of reducing violence against the activities. That's not to say it's not a good thing to do for the sake of humanitarian reasons. But this leads me into the second point, and I'd recommend that you look at the work of Ashley Jackson at the Overseas Development Institute. She did 2 papers called Talking to the Other Side, one of which is focused on Afghanistan, one of which is focused on Somalia. And as we talked about earlier, if you have certain rules and norms established at the higher echelons of a business that say you cannot pay a bribe, you cannot do X, Y, and Z, and that is often reflected in the expatriate management, you might have a divide growing between you and your local staff. And what you have is lying. And it's not because they're bad. It's just, hey, if you've taken this off the table of options, I know I can't tell you about it. And so Ashley Jackson did a great job of interviewing humanitarian actors, both the expatriate management and the local staff, and saying, all right, tell me how this thing works. And what you get from the expatriate management is, well, we do principled community engagement. That's a euphemism for somebody goes out there and talks to whoever's in charge, whether that's Taliban, criminal, host government, whatever, and they work whatever deals they have to work to make this thing happen because we want to deliver assistance on the basis of need. And that you talk to the local staff, and they'll say, well, yeah, first off, they probably won't tell you what's really going on. And then you talk to them for a while, and they say, actually, this is the way the game is played. And I think she's really unique in adding to the literature on that because we talk about in principles, but in fact, there is this dynamic that's going on beyond our view.
I'd just like to push back against that for a second because, yes, that does typically happen. My experience, and one might be tempted to say, oh, Sarah must be one of these expats who got duped by her folks. The fact was I actually live there and speak the language, and people actually told me there was once that we paid a bribe, in fact. And, so we were kind of in it together. And what we found, it took a lot of pushing back. But what we found was when we pushed back, we didn't have to pay the bribes. And so what I would suggest is that that's 90 or 95% of the experience, because fundamentally, foreigners want to get shit done, right? They also don't want to pay bribes, but what they really want is to get shit done. And so what their local, kind of fixers and facilitators do is understand that guidance. I mean, they pick up on what is the primary objective of this person. So I mean, I'm talking about how I functioned after I had been in the country for 3 or 4 years. In the beginning, believe me, in the first organization I ran, I know that was exactly I now know that that's what was going on. Because the signal that I was sending out was that I wanted to get stuff done. And so there's, and so I guess what I'm driving at is when you make it clear what your priorities are, it turns out you don't have to do it that way. You really don't. But you have to really want to not do it that way. And that's when, once you kind of push through to that, that's when business investment can actually be a force for changing the local incentive structure instead of reinforcing it.
I mean, I have a fun vignette where I was in a similar position. Something came to my attention. I'm like, wow, the world as I thought it was clearly doesn't work the way it does. But the best part was this was an NGO that was very highly rated for women's rights in Afghanistan, where I thought there was at least some type of policy coherence between us and them, recognized by the State Department. And the best part was once they admitted that they had lied on all their teacher payment forms, that they had submitted falsified, and again, it's very difficult to catch this, right? Even if you can read it, thumbprints, I'm not a forensic expert. The best part was the reaction to this problem was to give me a picture of them handing who I was told by other people was the father of the local Taliban commander, $9,000 in cash to pay their teachers. And they gave this to me and said, we fixed it. I mean, it's one of these things, and it leads me almost to say, well, how can you do it? And I guess in a very localized where you can kind of watch most of it, a very dedicated, very focused person, I think, can lock that down. But particularly as we get further and further into these conflict pieces, it's really tricky.
That's the issue.
I just want to come back one more thing on CSR. I think CSR to some extent gets a bad rap because there is a history of companies who have been sort of outed or at least accused of being complicit in large scale corruption or human rights abuses. Funding a lot of community engagement projects in order to try to distract attention away from it and sort of greenwash their reputation. And I think that's unfortunate because I think, as I talked about earlier, I think you can do effective CSR or corporate philanthropy, and it can be meaningful, and there shouldn't be any sort of reason why any prohibition against it. But I think it has to be recognized that is totally distinct from your responsibility as a company to make sure that you have a very clear understanding of how you impact people's rights through your business. And so a company who's doing that doesn't necessarily need to do CSR. That we would say that's the first thing you should focus on. If you do that, then you are a responsible business. If you do CSR in addition, great, that's gravy. But companies should not be spending a lot of money and time on corporate social responsibility and then completely neglecting the sort of more fundamental ways in which their presence or their operations are undercutting the entire edifice of rights that they claim to be addressing in a particular way through a particular project.
So what's really fun about that point is that the U.S. government would do well, as a whole, would do well to listen to what you just said. So often in so many of these environments, you've got the U.S. government, putting $1 billion in military assistance into a country, and then via USAID having a kind of, or your shop, having a couple $100,000 that goes towards human rights or anti-corruption or whatever it might be. So this is the fundamental point: is, what activities of the actor are actually impacting the environment.
Great. I saw we had maybe a couple of other questions. We're going to try to wrap this up, as close to 3:30 as we can here. But let's get your question over here. Please identify yourself.
Hi, My name is Tom Scher. I work at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I was recently tasked with answering this question: can we find examples of the private sector in conflict areas making a difference? And there were a lot of negative examples, but I'll share a few positive ones since we don't seem to have too many of those
right.
in the discussion today. So one, the private sector is often credited in South Africa with helping plan dialogues to end apartheid. In Sri Lanka, the trade associations were mentioned as mobilizing citizens after airport bombing to help kind of mobilize for peace. And in Colombia, the private sector teamed up with government reintegration programs to help offer employment to people coming out of combat. So there's maybe some good examples, but I think this also goes back to these are all pre-conflict or post-conflict. So the examples in conflict, I think, are much harder to find. And the only one I could find there was Roshan in Afghanistan being credited with 6% of government's domestic revenue, which is pretty good, but as Daniel pointed out, the lack of government funds doesn't seem to be the issue there. I mean, for the US, it's nice to see that, but for Afghanistan, not so helpful. So I guess the question, if I was going to pose one, is what, if any, then should our role be? And I think, Sarah, you kind of just answered this. What should our role be at all in active conflict nation building? So we'll take the pressure off USAID and say the British get involved in another active conflict. They're engaged in state building, and you've all been asked to help advise DFID that the government's come to DFID and said we're getting involved and we need the private sector to be part of this peace building exchange. What, if any, would you actually advise them on?
Who wants to tackle that one?
How you want to start?
I'll take two pieces just because I think the 3:30 is partly, I have a kind of hard stop, so I might dash, and there's no reason you guys can't, kind of continue a little bit. But I want to just pick up a thread from what you said. I think there's also we're kludging two different thoughts. One is, what can private sector actors do to help a peace process? So the most wonderful recent example is the Tunisian Quartet, where you've got labor and management, which first of all had to make peace between themselves before they could then turn and knock the politicians' head together. And that really was a case where you were not going to, but they were teetering toward civil war at that time. So that's where actors can play due to potentially their economic clout in the case of both of those actors, or their talent or their dedication. They can really obviously do some serious peace building. But I think the premise of this conversation was kind of economic activity and economic growth. What is the relationship between that and reduction in conflict? And that's where I think the record is clearly quite a bit more opaque than people like to say. On what I would advise, Dolly, I think I would first of all tell DFID that they have got to get the Foreign Commonwealth Office in line with, you need to have the basic structure of a state that is, minimally responsive to and respected by its citizens before you can even think about what private sector actors do in that space. And then I think it's really important, having tried to build a small business in Afghanistan, the types of economic development projects that were being promoted were pretty distant from me. Meaning it was like stuff like roads, and roads are helpful, but number one, no export. I mean, there still isn't any export out of Afghanistan. We run an export business, and it's impossible to get stuff in and out. But secondly, I wasn't, a very experienced business person. And what I didn't see a lot of was kind of help for startups, help with business planning, help with, accounting, all of that kind of thing. So the kind of nuts and bolts of how do you actually run a business in a lot of these environments, and then maybe a little bit of help with all of the issues we've been talking about, like, okay, DFID, what happens when the government wants to extract this from me, or the Taliban are doing that to me? In other words, some really hard-headed advice about how to navigate a complicated environment. With that, I am very unfortunately gonna run with apologies, but this has been really a great conversation.
Thank you so much for joining
all
us.
of you guys. Where are you going?
Okay.
Did you?
Sure, yeah, why not?
Please.
I mean, it's not really my place, even in my unofficial capacity, to comment on policy, but I would say this. In my office, I keep a copy of The Gambler by Kenny Rogers. And when I think about what it is we could do that would be quite useful, it's just follow the prescriptions in there. And if we could get that right, whether it's a hypothetical DFID or someone else, I think that would be quite an improvement.
I mean, I guess my advice would be certainly try and do as much thinking before if you're trying to set up some kind of a public-private partnership for peace in a particular country, looking and understanding other examples of where that's been attempted and how it's worked and how it hasn't is obviously the first step. But I think also then, just as kind of a matter of methodology, getting the players around the table right in terms of, just bringing in a bunch of companies, you have to really sort of think hard and scratch your head about why these companies, what is it that they are going to do, or why are they important to this particular place, and then forging a consensus together with them. And again, I think it's really important that there needs to be at least 3 legs to the stool. It can't just be the government and the private sector. You need some sort of civil society presence and voice in order to then hash out a set of principles that everyone is going to agree ex ante will guide conduct, and everyone can acknowledge up front that it's going to be challenging and that there are going to be hiccups and it's going to be a roller coaster. But if you don't have those principles up front, you're never going to agree to them once people are already kind of engaged in activities that may give them a certain vested interest or bias their perspective. And then be sort of setting up some kind of accountability mechanism to sort of come back and say, okay, how are we doing mapping our activities against these principles? That's basically the multi-stakeholder approach. The challenge is you really never get to start from kind of zero, right? You've already got a bunch of companies who are already there, and you've already got a bunch of entrenched actors on the government side, and a lot of non-state actors who are also entrenched and influential. And so good luck getting them to the table to agree on a bunch of principles ex ante, unless you have some real leverage. Which sometimes a government actor can, if you've got a lot of money that you're talking about putting on the table, that can help, but it's a challenge.
Yeah. Well, just to sort of wrap up here, I mean, I think some of the lessons that we have here are certainly that in a full-out conflict situation, you're never going to see the same level of sort of economic activity to bolster anything approaching peace. But at the same time, I think you have to recognize that even in the middle of full-out conflict, that it's very important as part of your strategy for working in that country to include the various actors that are going to be important to the post-conflict environment. So just because there's full-out conflict doesn't mean that you aren't having your discussions with private sector leaders, with civil society actors. I mean, this is certainly the approach that we've recommended in these sorts of situations. And also incorporating any kind of international standards that you can, international standards of corporate governance, of open government partnership. All of these kinds of things can create different pressure points to sort of move from that conflict environment into a sort of post-conflict environment where maybe you have more capacity to be able to make change and to generate more economic activity in a positive, non-corrupt sort of way. So thank you very much. I want to please join me in thanking our speakers, our main speakers.